Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa reiterated South Africa's stance on Israel's actions on Palestinians. Ramaphosa said that the country would not remain silent as apartheid is perpetrated against others, and further stressed for calls for an immediate ceasefire in the region. And the president also called for reforms to the UN Security Council. Now, let's discuss this further with international relations expert Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kingsley. What are your thoughts? Good morning.
Thanks very much, Marcel, for the invitation. You know, the General Assembly this year was twofold. There was one discussion on the Summit of the Future, and of course there was a general debate. The Summit of the Future adopted a pact, but if you look at the pact, Marcel, it's quite a useful start. It addresses precisely even the question of the reform of the United Nations, but it reaffirms the centrality of the United Nations. It goes on to reaffirm international law, because there's been different debates around the rule-based law that is really driven by the US and some Western countries. But going back to the commitment of the rule-based international law, because there are different instruments that really deal with that. And these instruments have been ratified by many countries, so it's very useful. And I think the president made a contribution in terms of the reform of the United Nations. But Chaba, the tendency always when speaking about the reform of the United Nations is only focus on the Security Council. The United Nations is quite broad, the powers of the General Assembly, and there's a debate going on and researches that are going on that perhaps there's a need to evolve certain powers of the Security Council into the General Assembly to make it much more representative. And of course, there are views about how the future Security Council should look like. The US has this view that Africa should have 2 seats, but these 2 seats should not have a veto powers, which means Africa then becomes a second tier within the UN system.
So now what can we expect in the near future when it comes to this matter, Dr. Kingsley?
You know, that's why I'm saying, Chaba, what should happen is a broader discussion of how the powers of the Security Council and the powers of the General Assembly should evolve. And you can't have certain members in the Security Council who are having veto powers and others are not having veto powers. It's not a reform, it's the status quo, because that's how the status quo is. The 15 members in the Security Council, only 5 permanent members have a veto power. And that's what people are saying that has to change. And I think the debate should also focus on other entities or other bodies of the United Nations. I mean, there's a big debate now around the capacity of the Peace Council within the United Nations, and that Peace Commission within the United Nations. It's not having an impact. It's not felt in continents like Africa. And as you are saying, Mashaba, earlier on, that this time around, the general debate with the next part where the president made a very strong argument around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that given our history as a country, as he said, we can't allow to see the atrocities going on in that part of the world.
Yeah.
That debate has focused only now on the Palestinian and the Lebanese conflict with Israel. There are other conflicts that are going on in the Sahel, conflicts that are going on in the Sudan. And I think they haven't received a fair share of contribution by different heads of state who took to the platform during the general debate of the General Assembly.
Yeah, which brings me to my next question. I mean, South Africa has taken a constitutional stance in support of, for instance, Palestine, right? But is the world or even Africa doing enough?
I don't think we're doing enough as a country. And I think South Africa should really try to pioneer things, conflict resolution around the continent. I know there are different initiatives by a non-governmental organization, including the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, that it's having different dialogue around the resolution of conflicts in the continent. But I don't think there's much attention in terms of, at the global stage, to focus on these areas and put more resources. You would have seen the United States has committed about $420 million to help the Sudanese people to deal with the tragedy that comes as a result of this conflict. But what are we doing as a continent? Is there a financial commitment that comes from the continent? Somebody may argue and say, well, we are highly indebted in the continent. We have no resources and so on. But the whole world, Ms. Chavez, we're sitting, has a huge debt. And I tend to think this pact of the future should have incorporated the global debt that exists. I mean, there's $300 trillion debt that exists. And the world economy, Ms. Chavez, it's only 107 trillion. And there's no focus around how we're going to deal with this debt and how we're going to get the poor countries and highly indebted countries out of this thing. Because if you look at issues that are included in the pact, they require financial institutions, financial capacity. Where are resources going to come from? Without dealing with the debt, it's a very vicious spiral cycle that is going to affect the African continent mainly.
All right, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, thank you so much for your time. International relations expert, just weighing in there. Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly this week, President Ramaphosa had reiterated South Africa's stance on Israel's actions on Palestinians. So the doctor just coming in to weigh in there. And now